Few figures from the ancient world have been studied as extensively as Jesus of Nazareth. 4 Gospels tell us how he was born. They tell us how he died. They tell us how the world changed because of him. But for 18 years, they tell us almost nothing. The Gospels describe his birth. They describe one strange trip to the Jerusalem temple when he was 12. Then the page goes dark. He reappears at 30, standing in the Jordan River, about to begin the ministry that would define him. Between those 2 points sits roughly 80% of his entire life. Gone. Unrecorded. Never explained. So where was he? Why did the men who wrote his story leave the biggest chunk of it blank? And is that silence an accident of history, or something historians have quietly been able to answer for a while now? To answer that, we have to separate centuries of legend from what history actually supports. There are exactly 2 verses in the entire New Testament that touch these years directly. The first is Luke chapter 2. After the temple incident, Luke says simply that Jesus went back to Nazareth with his parents, obeyed them, and grew in wisdom and stature as the years passed. That's it. One sentence covering roughly a decade and a half of a person's life. No other detail. No names of friends. No description of a single ordinary day. The second clue comes later, in Mark chapter 6. When Jesus starts teaching in his hometown synagogue, the crowd doesn't ask about miracles. They ask a much more local question. Isn't this the Tekton? Mary's son? That Greek word, Tekton, is doing more work than most translations give it credit for. English Bibles usually render it Carpenter, but in 1st century Galilee, a region with almost no forests and an enormous amount of limestone, Tekton more accurately meant a builder, someone who worked stone, wood, and construction alike. A general-purpose craftsman, not a specialist in one material. This is a real linguistic point, not speculation. The word shows up in Greek building contracts from the period with that broader meaning, describing masons and general laborers as often as woodworkers. There's a third clue, and it's an absence rather than a statement. Joseph appears in the birth narratives and then vanishes completely from the adult story. He's never mentioned during Jesus' ministry, never present at a wedding, never quoted, never described again. Most historians treat this as strong circumstantial evidence that Joseph died sometime before Jesus turned 30. That single detail changes the picture. If the family's Tekton and provider was gone, the oldest son would have been expected, by the customs of the time, to take over the trade and support his mother and siblings. Ancient Jewish households didn't have a safety net beyond family. Someone had to earn. The Bible never states this outright, but it's the most widely accepted reconstruction among historians working from the text alone. So we have a craftsman, a missing father, a hometown that saw him as ordinary labor, not a rising star. That's almost everything Scripture gives us. No parables from this period, no named friends, no teachers, no turning points. Just a boy who obeyed his parents, grew older, and picked up a trade. Everything else is filled in by legend. But one body of archaeological evidence, uncovered only in the last century, may point to exactly where those missing years were spent. In 1887, a Russian traveler named Nicholas Notovich claimed he'd found the missing piece. At a monastery in Ladakh, he said monks showed him ancient scrolls describing a young Issa who journeyed to India and Tibet, studying under Hindu and Buddhist teachers before returning to Judea. His book became a sensation. It was also, almost immediately, torn apart by scholars. Within a few years, the German philologist Max Muller and other researchers who visited the same monastery found no such manuscript, and monks there denied Notovich had ever produced one. No credible scholar today treats the Issa scrolls as authentic. It's widely regarded as a fabrication. That hasn't stopped the idea from surviving in documentaries that never mention how thoroughly it was debunked. A second legend traveled the opposite direction. Medieval English tradition holds that Joseph of Arimathea brought the young Jesus with him on a trading voyage to Britain, even to the town that became Glastonbury. This idea has no basis in the Gospels and no evidence from the first century. It emerges centuries later in medieval monastic writing, later popularized by William Blake's poem Jerusalem. Historians classify it as folklore, not history. Both stories share the same problem. A poor craftsman's family in Roman Galilee had no realistic means for journeys of that scale. No wealth, no ships, no reason recorded anywhere to attempt either trip. So why do these legends keep coming back? Because silence is uncomfortable. When a story leaves an 18-year gap in the life of its central figure, later generations feel compelled to fill it. Legend rushes in wherever evidence runs out. But filling a gap with a good story isn't the same as filling it with history. If Jesus didn't travel across continents, what did he actually spend 18 years doing? The answer starts with just how small Nazareth really was. Archaeological surveys of the site estimate a population somewhere in the low hundreds. Many researchers put it around 200 to 400 people, though estimates vary depending on which excavation and which dating method you use. Some studies argue for a slightly larger figure, closer to 1,000. Either way, it was a modest farming village, not a town, with maybe a few dozen houses built along a hillside. A community that small couldn't support a full-time construction trade. There simply wasn't enough building work in Nazareth itself to keep a craftsman's family fed year-round. Which raises an obvious question. Where did the work actually go? 4 miles north sat Sepphoris. The Roman client king Herod Antipas had made it his capital, and after an earlier revolt left parts of the city in ruins, he poured enormous resources into rebuilding it. The historian Josephus called it the ornament of all Galilee. Archaeologists have since uncovered colonnaded streets, a theater seating thousands, elaborate mosaic floors, bathhouses, and Roman-style villas. Picture what a young laborer from Nazareth would have walked into. Roman soldiers stationed along the main roads. Marble and imported stone being hauled up, scaffolding by hand. Merchants trading in goods that never reached a village like Nazareth. The constant ring of chisel against limestone, dust in the air from sunrise to sunset. Tax collectors moving through the crowd, recording what was owed to Rome. And side by side with all of it, a visible, daily gap between the wealth of the elite commissioning these buildings and the laborers whose hands were actually building them. That rebuilding project ran for years, and years of major construction meant a constant demand for skilled labor drawn from the surrounding villages, Nazareth almost certainly among them. Here's the honest historical line. No ancient source names Jesus as having worked in Sepphoris. There's no inscription, no record, nothing that puts him there by name. What we have is a strong circumstantial case, argued by numerous historians and archaeologists. A Tekton living an hour's walk from the biggest building project in the region during the exact years that project was underway. Many scholars consider it likely. It remains an inference, not a documented fact, and any honest account has to say so plainly. And if that inference holds, it means something significant. Working in Sepphoris would have exposed Jesus to a world entirely unlike Nazareth. Roman architecture and engineering on a scale nothing in his hometown could match. Greek language and culture, since Sepphoris was religiously Jewish but culturally mixed, sitting on a major trade route. Visible wealth inequality between the elite building the city and the laborers building it for them. Heavy Roman taxation pressing down on ordinary families who had little to spare. And, running underneath all of it, the quiet, constant tension of a Jewish population living under an occupying empire, watching foreign power reshape their own region. None of that made it into a gospel headline, but it would have shaped, day after day, the man those gospels eventually describe. He didn't disappear for 18 years. He almost certainly spent them doing what most people in his position did, working, providing, watching the world around him up close, long before he ever spoke a public word about it. Before he carried a cross, he almost certainly carried stone. If this period mattered so much, why didn't the gospel writers just say so? The answer has less to do with secrecy and more to do with what a gospel actually was. Ancient biographies, as a genre, weren't written the way modern ones are. Writers of the period rarely tracked a subject year by year. They selected the moments that revealed character or fulfilled a purpose and skipped the rest without apology. Entire decades of a person's life could be compressed into a single line because the audience wasn't expecting a full timeline. They were expecting meaning. The Gospels were written specifically to document a public mission, teaching, healing, and the events surrounding a crucifixion and resurrection claim. Everything before that mission began was, by the standards of the genre, background, worth a sentence at most, which means the silent years weren't necessarily empty of significance. They were years the authors classified as preparation rather than proclamation, labor instead of ministry, obedience instead of public teaching. To a first-century audience, that framing wouldn't have felt like an omission at all. To the writers of the New Testament, that simply wasn't the story they'd set out to tell. It's worth remembering that this wasn't unusual for the time. Roman and Greek biographers did the same thing with generals, philosophers, and emperors, skipping childhoods and quiet years to focus on the deeds that made a person worth writing about in the first place. Judged by that ancient standard, the Gospels weren't hiding anything. They were simply following the rules of the genre they were written in. So where was Jesus before 30? Strip away the legends of India and Britain, and the strongest historical conclusion left standing is also the plainest one. He was almost certainly in Galilee, working a trade, supporting a household that had lost its father, living, like millions of others under Roman rule, an unremarkable daily life in the shadow of a rebuilding empire. Perhaps history's greatest mystery was never where Jesus spent those missing years. Perhaps it was why we assumed ordinary work could never prepare someone for an extraordinary mission. But if Jesus' missing years remain history's greatest silence, another mystery has puzzled Bible readers for thousands of years. Who were the Nephilim? And were they really the giants the world imagines? That's where our next investigation begins.